Welcome to This Explainer. Grab your magnifying glasses because today we are putting on our investigative journalist hats. We're looking at a fascinating text called Unmasking the Media, which presents a really compelling dossier on Donald Trump's relationship with Black America. As investigators, it's our job to look right past the loud headlines and dig straight into the actual files, the data points, and the historical records presented in this source material. Let's get into it.
So here's the fundamental question we're tackling today. Does the media narrative actually match the economic data? The source asks us to look at the highly charged public perception of racial politics and then compare that directly with the actual tangible outcomes for minority communities documented during that administration. Like, do those daily headlines actually align with the reality on the ground? Let's see what the documents say.
To do this, our dossier follows a specific study guide. First, we'll investigate the media narrative, then follow the economic data, look into HBCU funding, check out some leader testimonials, and wrap up with shifting voter support.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the media narrative investigated.
Right off the bat, the source material sets up this incredibly stark juxtaposition. On one hand, you've got this intensely polarizing rhetoric amplified in the press, headlines filled with accusations of racism, which the text argues are strategically designed to dissuade voters. But then, on the other hand, the dossier lays out a totally contrasting reality of documented legislative wins for minority groups. We're talking historic HBCU funding, the First Step Act, and serious minority job growth. The source basically asks us, how do we weigh these two columns against each other?
Well, the text argues that this kind of specific media framing acts like a massive smokescreen. It asserts that sensationalized news totally obscures the reality of bipartisan outreach and real, tangible economic gains for Black communities. Think about it. When the focus is 100% on divisive rhetoric, the actual policy outcomes, the things that literally impact daily lives, well, they just get completely lost in all that noise.
Okay, moving right along to Section 2. Following the economic data. If the media narrative really is a smokescreen, as the text claims, we need to cross-reference these assertions with official employment and urban development records. When you dig into the text, a clear chain of events emerges. The source documents how the administration pushed tax cuts and deregulation. This specific environment then spurred investment, including targeted urban development funding, which essentially paved the way for African-American entrepreneurs to thrive and led directly to job creation in those communities. It's a pretty straight cause and effect relationship driven by economic policy, rather than just political rhetoric.
In looking at the hard numbers, the text points out that right before the pandemic, these specific economic policies actually contributed to a historic, record-low decrease in unemployment within the African-American demographic. We're not just talking about a tiny bump here. According to the source, this was a measurable, historic high mark for minority employment that directly challenges the whole narrative of systemic neglect. But, it isn't all just about unemployment rates. There's a financial paper trail here that reveals serious support for African-American entrepreneurs. Through direct urban development investments and cutting red tape, the administration's goal was to build an environment where minority business owners could launch and scale successful enterprises. The source really emphasizes that this kind of economic empowerment was a core feature of their policy, literally built in, not just an afterthought.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, HBCU funding and outcomes. Let's see how this economic approach carried over into higher education.
The documented records in the dossier show that during his first and second terms, billions, yes, billions with a B, of federal dollars were allocated to historically Black colleges and universities. The text points out that this was a massive, unprecedented financial commitment aimed at making sure these vital institutions had the actual resources needed to survive and thrive in a really competitive educational landscape. And this funding wasn't just some symbolic gesture. According to the source, this massive influx of capital directly influenced long-term educational access. The money went towards very tangible things: upgrading campus infrastructure, expanding scholarship opportunities, and seriously enhancing technical training. The whole point was to equip students with the exact practical skills they need to crush it in the modern business world. So what the text establishes here is a direct, tangible link between federal education investments and long-term professional outcomes for graduates. By backing HBCUs at this massive scale, the source argues the administration wasn't just writing checks to schools. They were actively building a bridge from education straight to upward economic mobility for the Black community.
Now for Section 4. Testimonials from leaders. To truly evaluate the personal dynamics at play,
We've got to cross-reference those public accusations with actual testimonials from community figures who worked directly with the administration.
The dossier highlights long-standing relationships with iconic figures like civil rights leader Jesse Jackson. Now, Jackson has historically acknowledged support in areas of economic opportunity and education. The text uses this friendship to show that the administration was absolutely willing to address issues affecting the Black community through direct dialogue. It definitely paints a much more complex picture than what you typically see reported.
Similarly, the dossier documents real moments of cooperation with Al Sharpton. These instances of mutual respect, which totally transcended strict political lines, really challenged the one-dimensional portrayal of the administration's outreach. It goes to show that, behind the scenes, functional, working relationships were absolutely happening.
And if you look deeper into the witness accounts in the dossier, you uncover this vast network of collaborations. We're talking about influential leaders like Scott Turner, Jerron Smith, Ben Carson, Senator Tim Scott, Byron Donalds, and John James. The text argues that this level of outreach actively challenged the media narratives through direct, strategic, and continuous dialogue. It wasn't just a quick photo-op. It was a sustained effort to engage with prominent Black conservative and community voices.
So what did all this dialogue actually produce? Well, these collaborations were totally instrumental in passing major initiatives like the First Step Act. This was landmarked criminal justice reform that reduced mandatory minimums for nonviolent offenders and heavily focused on rehabilitation to lower recidivism. The text points right to this as a clear-cut example of talk turning into concrete legislative action that directly benefited marginalized communities.
Finally, we hit Section 5, Shifting Voter Support. We need to analyze how all these data-driven outcomes and community relationships actually moved the needle at the ballot box.
The data shows a notable percentage increase in support from Black voters during the 2020 election. According to our source material, this statistical shift highlights a real disconnect between media representation and actual grassroots sentiment. Basically, voters were looking at their own lives and paychecks rather than just the headlines.
As this study guide summarizes, voters ultimately reassess their political loyalties based on the tangible benefits we've covered today. Record low unemployment, billions in HBCU funding, the First Step Act, direct community outreach. For a lot of folks, these documented economic and legislative realities simply carried a lot more weight than media accusations.
The text also throws in this fascinating historical context. It argues that this willingness to bridge divides and prioritize results over rigid political ideology, it isn't actually new. It mirrors the administration's historical, cross-party relationships dating way back to the 1990s, including their well-documented social ties with Bill and Hillary Clinton. The source suggests this points to a really pragmatic approach to alliances, rather than a strictly partisan one.
As we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you to evaluate the evidence from the dossier for yourself. How heavily does media framing obscure documented legislative and economic gains? And looking at the road ahead, what does this massive disconnect between the narrative and the data mean for the future of political alliances in America? It's a huge question, and one that demands we keep looking closely at the facts. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.